We're told the ideal life is a safe one. We organize our days around pleasure and mindless consumption, trying to build a perfectly sterile environment where nothing can challenge us. But the moment real life enters the room, that illusion starts to fracture. Reality is inherently brutal, and when you finally acknowledge this gap between your current, highly flawed state and the ideal self you know you should be, the sheer distance between the two triggers instant psychological paralysis. Faced with that unbearable pressure, the easiest instinct is to freeze. We convince ourselves that delaying action is the safest route, believing that if we just hold perfectly still, we can avoid failure while those unmade decisions pile up. Inaction is never neutral. It is an active choice to avoid reality. You age, the clock runs out, and the cumulative weight of those decisions you refuse to make becomes the true source of your existential stress. When you retreat from the difficulties you know you need to face, you don't stay safely in place. Avoidance creates a vacuum, forcing you to regress and pulling you into an involuntary downward spiral. Watching from the sidelines while others take action breeds a specific kind of internal poison. You begin to harbor deep, quiet resentment and intense jealousy toward the very people who possess the competence you abandoned. Left unchecked, that resentment hardens into pure cynicism. Rather than building something of your own, your focus shifts entirely toward tearing down the success of others, driving you into highly destructive behaviors. Clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson notes that the only reliable escape from this psychological trap is direct confrontation. You must voluntarily expose yourself to the exact obstacles you are currently terrified of. This necessity suggests a difficult truth. Our psychological health depends on the presence of a meaningful burden. Without the friction of a voluntary challenge to rise against, our personality systems simply degrade into the cynicism and resentment we've just described. Embracing voluntary difficulty requires a functional way to measure your progress. If you set the wrong baseline for success, the pressure will immediately crush any momentum you try to build. Measuring your progress against other people is mathematically useless. You have no idea what invisible advantages they were handed, what specific genetic talents they possess, or what private tragedies shape their daily lives. To get an accurate metric, look at this singular data point. You are the only valid control group for yourself. The only logical baseline you can reliably measure against is exactly who you were yesterday. Shifting the baseline entirely inward strips away the impossible weight of external expectations. Growth stops being an unwinnable social competition and becomes a mathematically achievable daily reality. Even with the right baseline, a distant ideal can look like an invincible dragon. When a goal is massive and complex, your brain flags it as a monolithic threat and refuses to initiate action. To bypass that threat response, scale the dragon down to size. Increase the resolution of your plan until the overwhelming monolith fractures into tiny, discrete pieces. Keep shrinking the gap until you locate a task so small you are genuinely willing to complete it today. Isolating a single microtask gives your mind a break. It prevents you from trying to mentally process every connected limitation, problem, and potential future disaster all at the exact same time. This single microstep systematically short-circuits the psychological barrier holding back the entire macroscopic goal. There is a heavy emotional cost to starting this way. Acknowledging that you have to begin at the absolute bottom, where you are weakest, is deeply humiliating. Looking inside a single messy drawer and accepting that cleaning it is the absolute limit of your current capacity is tough. So is raising your hand to ask a seemingly stupid question. Both actions force you to publicly confront your own ignorance. We often mistake humility for a passive weakness. In reality, humility is the brutally honest acceptance of your flawed starting coordinates. Swallowing that embarrassment is the required entry fee for competence. You simply cannot fix a weakness if your pride refuses to look at it. Looking at this chart reveals the law of compounding momentum. Just as avoidance accelerates a rapid downward slide into defeat, taking voluntary microactions triggers an exponential upward climb. Every time you complete a tiny task, you gather new data and correct an error. You acquire compound interest in your own strength, which translates into specific, measurable increases in your practical ability to affect the world. Stretching slightly past your known limits proves to your brain that you can handle resistance. This generates true, competence-based confidence, replacing the fragile ego of unearned narcissism. Once you lock into consistent action, the internal architecture of resentment collapses. The sheer friction of forward momentum actively burns away your capacity for cynicism and bitterness. Eventually, you cross a threshold. You look back at the limitations that used to paralyze you and realize they were largely self-imposed illusions. We don't actually know the upper limits of this growth. If an individual refuses to avoid what they must do over several decades, we simply haven't seen where that capacity for expansion finally stops. Compare that immense, expanding capability to the fragile existence we mapped out at the beginning, a life spent desperately optimizing for temporary comfort while hiding from the world. When you abandon the demand for an easy life and start scaling your dragons down to manageable pieces, you align with your actual nature. You aren't built for safety. You are built for maximal challenge.